The boy was sketching a superhero while softly humming a tune out front, lost in his world of crayons and courage, when it happened. Two men in matching navy polo shirts stepped out of a black SUV. The words HOA enforcement stitched across their chests looked official, but something about them didn't sit right. One of them walked up and, without a word, kicked the front wheel of the boy's wheelchair. It wasn't enough to flip it, but enough to jolt him. Enough to freeze his smile, stiffen his limbs, and send his sketchbook fluttering like a frightened bird across the pavement. Then someone stepped out of the house. Someone they never should have messed with. Sylvester Stallone. What happened next? You wouldn't believe it. But let's start from the beginning. Inside a modest brick house on the corner of Shady Oak Drive, Marria D'Angelo stood by the kitchen window, pouring herself a second cup of vanilla roast coffee. She loved this time of day. Before the world got loud, before the weight of everything she carried settled onto her shoulders. At the breakfast table, sipping black coffee, was Sylvester Stallone, or as little Mikey affectionately called him, Uncle Sly. They'd been friends since Marria worked as a set designer on one of Stallone's films in the late 90s. Life had pulled them in different directions, but when he heard she'd been widowed, her husband killed in a freak accident, leaving her to raise Mikey alone, he showed up. No fanfare, just showed up. Mikey had been left paralyzed from the same accident that took his father. But that didn't stop him from being one of the smartest, most passionate kids Sly had ever known, especially when it came to art. "How long's he been out there?" Stallone asked, glancing toward the driveway. "Since 7:30, Marria smiled. "He said today he's still playing real-life Rocky." Stallone chuckled. "Every hero needs an upgrade." Their laughter faded as a matte black SUV crept into the cul-de-sac. Tinted windows, no license plate. It didn't belong there. Marria stiffened, leaning forward. Guests were common. Delivery trucks, realtors, out-of-town relatives. But there was something about the way this vehicle slithered to a halt at the end of her drive that chilled her. "Expecting someone?" Stallone asked. She shook her head. "Number that car? Doesn't belong to anyone on this street." Two men emerged. They wore identical navy blue polos with HOA enforcement stitched on the chest. Their black tactical pants were cinched tight, radios clipped to their belts, clipboards in hand. One even had a bundle of plastic zip ties dangling from his hip. But Marria had served on the HOA board last year. She knew every officer, every contractor ever hired. These men, total strangers. The taller one had short blonde hair, aviator sunglasses, and a permanently pursed mouth that radiated disapproval. The second man was bulkier, bald, and sweating heavily, his face already red. They moved with square shoulders and a slow, smug confidence that sent something cold crawling up Maria's spine. Outside, Mikey didn't notice them at first. He was deep in the world of Skyclaw, his latest hero. Then the clipboard guy approached. He crouched slightly, scowling at the wheelchair, and said loud enough for Marria to hear from inside, "You're not allowed to be here. This is shared sidewalk." Mikey blinked. "But I live here." "You're obstructing public space," the man barked. Marria set down her cup and headed for the door. Stallone reached out, gently touching her arm. "Hold on. Let me." But she was already halfway out. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice steady but sharp. "He's on our driveway. He's not blocking anything." The clipboard man didn't even glance at her. Instead, he nodded toward Mikey. "This setup is non-compliant. doesn't meet ADA standards with sidewalk layout. You've been warned." "That's a lie," she snapped. "No one's ever said anything." "We are the HOA," the bulkier man barked. Then, without warning, the tall one kicked the front wheel of Mikey's chair. Not hard enough to tip him, but enough to jerk his body backward. Mikey's hands flew up. His pencil slipped. His sketchbook tumbled to the pavement, pages fluttering like leaves. He gasped. "Mom!" Marria ran. "What happened, baby?" she cried, dropping to her knees beside him. The tall man turned, clipboard still in hand, locking eyes with someone else. Sylvester Stallone had stepped out onto the porch. He stood on the top step, arms folded, jaw set tight. He wasn't angry. He wasn't rattled. He was focused, like a wolf measuring the distance before the leap. The clipboard man smirked. "Got a problem, old man?" Stallone looked at Mikey. The boy's knuckles were white, gripping the armrests. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. Then Stallone looked up. "Yeah," he said softly. "What you just did, that's going to be a problem." The big man stepped forward. "Mind your business, Grandpa." Stallone stepped off the porch. "I am the business." His voice was level, controlled, like a storm just beyond the horizon. Marria froze. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with something else. What happened next would change everything. The moment stretched like elastic, tight, silent, ready to snap. The man with the clipboard didn't seem to understand who he was facing. Maybe it was the gray in Stallone's hair. Maybe it was the calm, the steady way he stood, like he'd been in worse situations and come out standing. The taller man took a step forward, jabbing a finger. "This doesn't concern you. You step back now, or you'll be cited for obstruction too." Stallone didn't move. His expression didn't change. But Marria, still crouched beside Mikey, felt the shift in the air. A quiet tension. It was the same way she remembered watching him train decades ago, right before a spar, when everything about him went still, not with fear, but with purpose. "You don't lay hands on a kid in a wheelchair," he said, voice even. "Especially not when he's doing nothing but drawing jets on his own driveway." The heavy-set man scoffed. "What are you, his lawyer?" "I'm his mother's friend," Stallone replied. "And I've got a pretty low tolerance for cowards who fake uniforms." "You calling us fake?" the clipboard man growled. Stallone tilted his head. "You got ID? A city badge? You part of the Pasadena enforcement list?" "No? Then yeah, I'm calling you fake." That was when the clipboard man lunged. It wasn't graceful, more of a shove than a strike, his hand flat and aiming for Stallone's chest. But that was all it took. In one motion, smooth as breath, Stallone sidestepped the lunge, grabbed the man's arm, twisted just enough to break his momentum, and brought his elbow down across the man's forearm with a crack that echoed against the brick homes. The clipboard flew. The man yelped and crumpled to the pavement. His sunglasses skittered down the driveway, landing next to Mikey's sketchbook. The second man reacted faster, barreling toward Stallone with both arms raised. He was bigger, more brute force than technique. But Stallone didn't flinch. He stepped in instead of back, hooked the man's arm midair, turned his own body into the movement, and swept the man's leg out with one fluid motion. The heavier man hit the ground hard, his head bouncing once against the concrete, his tactical belt clanging uselessly. Neighbors had started to gather now. Some watched from porches, others raised phones. A couple kids stood frozen on the sidewalk across the street, their basketball rolling slowly toward a gutter. One woman whispered, "Is that really Stallone?" Another said, "Oh my God, did he just drop that guy?" Marria held Mikey close, still shaken, but the boy was wide-eyed with awe. "He fights like a movie," he whispered. "Better," Marria murmured. "He fights like a father." Stallone didn't gloat. He didn't raise his fists, or flex or shout. He just stood over the two men, breathing steady, eyes sharp. "You showed up with fake uniforms, no authority, and you kicked a kid in a wheelchair. You're lucky I didn't let the neighbors handle this." The man with the injured arm whimpered, trying to crawl toward the SUV. The other one wasn't moving. Sirens approached in the distance. A neighbor across the street, Hank Weller, retired Coast Guard, held up his phone. "I got it all. From the second they got out of the car. The cops are gonna want this." Stallone turned toward Marria. "You and Mikey okay?" She nodded, finally rising, one hand still on her son's shoulder. "Yeah, I think so." Then she looked around and noticed that nearly half the street had come out. Cameras were still up. One young guy in his 20s had already gone live on Instagram. "They kicked a disabled kid," he was saying into his phone. "And then Rocky Balboa came off the porch and laid him out. This is real." Two Pasadena police cruisers rolled in seconds later. The officers stepped out fast but cautious, eyes scanning the scene. One of them, a younger cop, froze for half a beat when he recognized Stallone. Then he remembered his job. "What happened here?" he asked. Marria stepped forward. "They pretended to be HOA enforcement. No ID. They kicked my son's wheelchair and tried to intimidate him." One of the men on the ground groaned. "We didn't touch him." Stallone stepped aside, giving the officers room. "You can ask the neighbors. Check the videos. This kid was on his driveway. Those two started something ugly, and they didn't expect anyone to push back." The older officer knelt beside the man with the bent arm. "This guy's hurt," he muttered, waving over the paramedics who had just arrived. "Looks like you've got a dislocated shoulder and maybe a busted pride." The younger cop helped the other man to his knees. "You got ID?" he asked. "I left it in the car," the man lied. "Let's see the car." The SUV was unlocked. Inside, the officers found laminated HOA enforcement cards with no city seal, no barcode, no contact info. Just plain printouts in cheap holders. A bag in the trunk contained more of the same, along with an empty box labeled "Security Uniforms, Halloween Special." That was enough. The two men were arrested on the spot. Charges: impersonating a public official, assault on a minor, trespassing, and potentially conspiracy if any other complaints surfaced. As paramedics lifted the heavier man onto a stretcher, he winced and hissed, "He broke my arm." The officer raised an eyebrow. "You kicked a kid in a wheelchair. You're lucky all you got was a broken arm." Stallone stood silently beside Marria and Mikey. He hadn't said much since the sirens arrived. He didn't need to. His presence said everything. Mikey looked up. "Is he going to jail?" he asked softly. The officer nodded. "Both of them are." Mikey reached down to pick up his sketchbook. One corner was bent, the drawing of Skyclaw smudged where the pages had scraped the pavement. He held it close to his chest. "You think Skyclaw could have handled those guys?" Stallone asked, crouching next to him. Mikey's eyes lit up. "Yeah, but I think you did better." Stallone gave a small smile, then tapped Mikey's drawing gently. "I just did what any decent guy would do. You're the one with real superpowers. You kept your cool." From across the street, someone called out, "Local news is on the way. They're asking if Stallone's really here." Marria groaned. Oh no. Stallone sighed. Let me guess. This ends up on YouTube with dramatic music? Hank the neighbor laughed. Too late. Kid down the street already uploaded it. It's got 15,000 views. And climbing. Stallone shook his head. All I did was stop a bully. Marria looked at him, eyes damp. Number. You reminded this neighborhood what courage looks like. And just like that, the sun rose higher over Cedar Glen Estates, warming the quiet aftermath of what had nearly been a tragedy. But instead, it became something else, something honest, powerful, and deeply American. By the next morning, everything had changed. Marria woke to the sound of her phone buzzing non-stop, text alerts, missed calls, and messages from neighbors, friends she hadn't spoken to in years. Even a few unfamiliar numbers, leaving voicemails just saying, "Is that really you? Is that Mikey?" Confused, she opened her phone and was greeted with a blurry still from a video. Stallone, mid-motion, fist drawn back, the HOA imposter's face frozen in pre-impact dread. Mikey was in the background, eyes wide, the sketchbook on his lap like a shield. The caption read, "Fake HOA thugs kick disabled kid." But they forgot who was visiting. The video had over 3 million views. It had been posted overnight and had already spread to Facebook, Reddit, Twitter, and a dozen YouTube compilations. The top comment under the video read, "This is the kind of justice you don't learn in courtrooms." Stallone still got it. That kid's got a guardian angel with a left hook. She sat stunned on the edge of her bed, scrolling through messages until she heard movement downstairs. In the kitchen, Stallone stood exactly as he had the morning before. Calm, black coffee in one hand, a quiet steadiness in his shoulders that hadn't changed since the moment he stepped off the porch. He looked up as she entered, didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth tugged just slightly. "They found the clip, huh?" he asked, turning back to his mug. Marria let out a breath that was half a laugh. "Found it? They added music, captions, slow motion effects. It's on every major news site. Mikey's calling you Skyclaw." He chuckled softly. "Kid's got good taste." She moved to sit across from him. The police said those guys had been doing this in 3 different counties, intimidating older folks, families, charging fake HOA fees. No one pushed back. Until now. He nodded slowly. Sometimes a punch is the only language bullies understand. But it hadn't just been the punch. Within hours of the video going viral, major news outlets picked it up. Local stations ran headlines like, "Sylvester Stallone steps in to defend disabled boy from impersonators." National news followed. There were interviews with neighbors, footage of the imposter's arrest, even a brief shot of Mikey's crumpled sketchbook, now framed on the living room mantel. Twitter was ablaze. Skyclaw trended for almost an entire day. On Facebook, groups dedicated to veterans and disability rights flooded with support, gratitude, and outrage. YouTube creators broke the video down frame by frame, like it was a historic sports moment. But what hit Marria hardest was the messages. Hundreds of them, from parents of disabled children, from veterans, from caregivers, from quiet men and women who had lived through similar intimidation but never found their voice. "Thank you," they wrote. "Thank him for us." One message from a woman in Oregon simply read, "My daughter uses a wheelchair too. I hope someday someone like that stands up for her." 3 days after the incident, the mayor's office reached out. Mikey had been nominated for a Youth Courage Award from the local community center. They called it a recognition of bravery in the face of aggression. But for Mikey, it meant something simpler, It meant being seen. On the afternoon of the ceremony, the community center buzzed with more people than it had held in years. There were kids, parents, reporters, and volunteers. Balloons in red, white, and blue adorned the windows. A local cosplayer arrived in a custom sky claw outfit, complete with silver wings and a hand-sewn patch of Mikey's original drawing on the chest. Mikey rolled into the room wearing a navy blazer, a little oversized at the sleeves, but his smile fit just right. Marria sat beside him, beaming. Stallone stood off to the side, in jeans and a gray t-shirt, hands in his pockets like he wanted nothing more than to disappear into the background. When the MC called Stallone to the stage, he shook his head. "Not my moment," he muttered, and stayed where he was. Mikey accepted the award, a handmade cape in silver and red, with Sky Claw's name stitched across the back. When he was handed the microphone, he looked at the crowd, then back at Stallone. "I didn't think anyone was going to help me, but he did. And now I want to do that for other people, too." The applause was loud, and Marria found herself wiping away tears she hadn't realized were coming. After the ceremony, another boy, about Mikey's age, also in a wheelchair, rolled up shyly. "Hey," he said, voice soft, "I saw the video. You made me feel like we're not invisible." Mikey grinned. "We're not. We just needed someone to show them." Later that night, back at the house, Stallone helped Mikey tape the award cape above his bed. Marria stood in the doorway, arms crossed over her chest, watching them. "There's one more thing," she said, and handed Mikey a sealed envelope. He opened it carefully, his fingers shaking with anticipation. Inside was a letter of acceptance and a full scholarship to a junior martial arts program for kids with disabilities. It was paid for entirely by a private donor. At the bottom corner of the letter was a small insignia, a veterans foundation Stallone had helped found years ago. Mikey's hands trembled as he looked up. "I get to train like you." Stallone smiled and ruffled his hair. "No, kid, you're going to train better." Legal proceedings moved swiftly. With the overwhelming video evidence, multiple eyewitnesses, and the discovery of fake uniforms in the suspects' homes, both men pleaded guilty. The charges: impersonating law enforcement, attempted fraud, assault on a minor. They were sentenced to prison and fined restitution to victims across the counties. But it didn't stop there. The state launched a review of all private security contractors used by HOAs. Several were suspended, and oversight was implemented. Other families came forward. The dominoes had begun to fall. A month later, a mural appeared on the side of the community center. It showed Mikey in his wheelchair, one hand raised like a jet pilot. Behind him stood Stallone, hand on the boy's shoulder, mid-motion, with the words painted in bold across the top. "Real power protects. It doesn't pray." Mikey visited the mural every week. He would point out little details to his friends, how the artist had included the crumpled sketchbook, how Sky Claw's wings stretched just slightly past the frame. Marria started printing the image on t-shirts for a local fundraiser. The first week they sold over 700. All proceeds went to support adaptive athletic programs and veteran re-entry services. And even Stallone, the reluctant hero, had to admit, this little neighborhood story had become something bigger. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped behind the red-tiled rooftops, Marria and Stallone sat on the porch. Mikey was inside, already sketching something new. Stallone watched the sky. "Never thought one punch would start all this," he said softly. Marria looked at him, then back at the glowing windows of their home. It wasn't just the punch. It was why you threw it. Stallone nodded. Still, feels strange being called a hero for something that just felt right. Inside, Mikey held up a fresh drawing. The title, written in bold blue crayon, read Justice Jaw. The character wore a leather jacket, silver streaks at the temples, and a stare that could quiet a room. Mikey shouted from his room, "Mom!" I gave him upgraded elbows. Marria smiled. "That one's you," she said to Stallone. He exhaled slowly, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Hope he's got better knees." They both laughed, and as stars began to poke through the darkening sky, the little neighborhood that had once been shaken by fear settled into something stronger, something rooted in pride, truth, and the unshakable power of a single act of courage. Because when the wrong people came with fake authority and tried to hurt what was most vulnerable, this place didn't stay silent. They stood, they filmed, they spoke, and justice didn't whisper. It came with a voice and a left hook